As the chaplain at church camp, my educational objective that was given to me was to educate our 54 campers about the Eucharist. It's kind of a tall order. And so that on our very last day, when all of the families and grandparents gathered to pick up, that we shared the Eucharist, and it was more significant for the young people, for the campers. Many of our campers were very familiar with this practice of the Eucharist, and they had many things to say, and they were familiar. And our Methodists at first said to me, wait, are you talking about communion? I said, oh yes, there's some terminology and some language difference here. So once we got on the same page, they were very familiar with the Holy Communion and the Eucharist, the Lord's Supper. And there were still a couple who had never heard of eating and drinking Jesus. And this sounded absolutely bizarre. Absolutely bizarre. It was a crazy idea. I'll always remember this one very, very kind and lovable, yes, and spirited 5th grader boy who said out loud, so Christians are cannibals. And people kind of chuckled, those who understood what that word even meant. And I, had this moment where I needed to be that teacher, right? And I said, the Eucharist is God's way of giving us everything. It's when Jesus goes all in. And they seem to be kind of agreeable with that sentiment and very happy to move on to the stamps and the marker activity that followed. But later, I think it was the following day, that same boy, we were down at the lake swimming. And those who wanted to be in the deep section had to take a swim test. And they needed to qualify that swim test. And so that swim test was from the dock to the shore 2 times, 2 laps. And it was very, very clear that this boy he wasn't the most confident or competent swimmer. And there was a lot more flailing than there was stroking the water. And so he was so determined, though. So I came and I swam next to him and was cheering him on all that way. It was kind of painful, but I was so, so proud when his full exhaustion, when he made it to the dock on that second lap. And he looked at me, and I almost didn't understand what he said because he was so out of breath. And he said, I went all in. And I was like, oh, my little chaplain heart was so pleased that scriptural lessons become part of daily life. So here we are, all again, and Sunday after Sunday, we have kind of been hearing the same thing. And we literally have been hearing some of the words exactly the same, which are Jesus saying, I am the bread of life. We have heard this so many times this summer. I am the eternal bread that has come from heaven. He is repetitive for 2 reasons, I think. Because it is so important and because it is very difficult to understand. There was another moment at camp that was not so tidy from an educational standpoint. I spent quite a bit of time with a 14-year-old girl learning her life story, and it was very painful. And almost all of that pain came from her parents. And I got to know her and be with her, and it was difficult. And so when every day we would receive prayers in the prayer box, and I would read the students' prayers, the campers' prayers out loud, and I knew that it was her prayer that said, my belief does not make sense. And I thought that of all of the misfortunes and brokenness in her life, and she had many, I thought, they are never meant to discourage her hope. And her prayer was so sincere. And it was a real prayer. And I did read it out loud, and I was kind of broken my voice was kind of cracking and broken as I prayed it out. My faith does not make sense. It wasn't making sense from the things she was experiencing in life. Jesus knows that what he is saying does not make sense. It's against our sense-making, against what life gives us. And so he's repetitive, and he's redundant, and he keeps hammering in our defenses until we can maybe comprehend. When he says bread, he's not talking about flour and water and yeast and air. He's talking about God coming to us. There is more here. Our thinking can be literal, and it can be flat and one-dimensional, and it can be demystified. So it's hard to understand the things that are beyond. But for those of us who are listening, Jesus wants us to listen. He says, the Word has become flesh. There is wisdom here. Consume it. Jesus is meeting us in our bodies, in our time, in our world. Jesus is not just an amazing teacher and a compassionate leader and a miracle worker. Jesus is the bread or the nourishment to be eaten and wine to be drunk from heaven. The fires of broken dreams and misfortunes are not meant to discourage hope, but lights to a greater hope that we might not really understand. Thank goodness that the Eucharist is vivid. That God came to say, I want this to endure. Thank goodness it's a little bit repugnant. It's a little bit gross in the way the camper said, are we cannibals? We're eating and drinking? Yes, this is provocative. It's provocative to our minds. It's provocative to our culture. The Levitical law said that you cannot eat flesh. And Jesus is saying, I am the flesh. All this is hard for us to understand, but it's so vivid. It's so easy. It's so basic. It challenges our customs of who's in and who's out. It challenges our biases of ethnic groups, who has access, who does not. Jesus' message is basic, and he says, consume me. Most of us work really hard to be cool-headed, and to be detached, and to be distant, and dispassionate. And so we find it very strange if we're told to think of the Word made flesh as something we need to digest and intimately engage in. Christ living is an awesome concept. But the reality is for you to be vulnerable. Without visceral participation, without engagement, we can just sit back comfortably in our concepts and coolly consider Jesus as an abstract person or a disembodied idea. But wisdom was made flesh in Jesus. Jesus is the living bread who feeds us not just for the Sunday, but for our lifetime. As we get up, as we come forward, as we hold out our empty hands and our longing and our honesty, and we chew, and we sip, and we take in Christ. Eat and drink I looked up what those verbs meant here in the Greek, and the verb to eat in the Greek is not really polite at all. It's not a close your mouth, I'm not seeing your food kind of thing. The verb is to chew or to like gnaw on. It's visceral, it's active. It's not what we think. And likewise in Greek, to drink my cup, my blood, it says, better translated is to gulp. It says active participation. It would be easier to think of Jesus as the one who offers love and answers our prayers, sustains us in grace. It would be easier to think of this as an intellectual assent. But no. The scandalous, carnal, incarnational truth is that Jesus wants to be all in, to bury deep within us, to be chewed and to be gulped and to flow through our veins and to be in every little nook and cranny of our being. The Eucharist is God giving us everything. So God intends to be all in with us, intimately available. And whoever knows this knows how to live.
Amen.